In the quiet heart of America, a decorated veteran named Richard Kane returned from war with invisible wounds that burned deeper than any scar. His bravery on the battlefield earned him medals, but the battles within his soul were relentless. Rage consumed him, driving him to destroy everything he once loved. One stormy night, Richard stormed into a small church, his hands trembling as he raised a gun toward the statue of the Virgin Mary. The marble shattered under his shot, fragments scattering across the floor. But in that instant, the impossible unfolded. A radiant light burst from the broken pieces, illuminating the entire sky. The Virgin appeared in glory, her presence restoring the statue as though untouched. Stunned and broken, Richard dropped his weapon, falling to his knees in tears. That night, a soldier of war was reborn as a servant of faith, forever changed by a miracle no bullet could destroy. Richard Kane stepped off the bus with a duffel bag, a medal case, and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to rest. The town had repainted its water tower and hung flags across Main Street, but the colors felt too bright, like paint poured over a bruise. The air smelled of cut grass and gasoline from the service station, and somewhere a lawn sprinkler clicked with patient rhythm, the same steady sound that used to lull him to sleep when he was a boy. Now every repetitive noise sounded like a fuse that refused to burn out. He walked past the bakery, where the windows fogged with heat and sugar, past the barber pole that spun with unearned cheer, and he felt the stairs gather on his back like burrs on a field jacket. Mothers told their children to step aside for the hero. Old men lifted 2 fingers from the brims of their hats. A high school kid muttered something about the uniform and went silent when Richard's eyes found him. He should have felt pride. He felt only a cold echo, as if the word hero had been spoken into a cave and had never returned. His mother waited on the porch in a summer dress, the color of cornflowers. Her hair, once black as river stones, showed threads of silver at the temples. She wrapped him in her arms, as if she could press out the creases in his spirit by holding him long enough. He hugged back because he remembered the choreography, not because the movement rose from him naturally. His father moved slower, pain in the hips, a carpenter's limp that told its own biography of ladders and winter roofs. They shook hands first, then his father pulled him in. The scent of sawdust clung to the man's shirt. It had always smelled like Sunday to Richard, when benches in the garage became pews, and the old radio hummed gospel songs that drifted up through the rafters. On the kitchen table waited a pie, a pitcher of sweet tea with ice cubes shaped like stars, and a handwritten note from the neighbors who could not wait, but wanted him to know that they were proud. He tried to swallow the sugar, but it stuck like wet sand in his throat. Questions appeared, soft and eager. How was the flight? Did he sleep on the bus? Did he keep in touch with anyone? Did he see the ocean from the base? He answered with sentences that were technically true and strategically incomplete. He did not tell them about the night a street came alive with wires and glass and screaming, or the morning a boy with a kite had walked too far into an open field, or the time he had shouted another man's name so loudly he had bitten his own tongue and bled through the vowels. At dusk, he walked alone to the lake. Fireflies rose in the weeds near the shore, small lamps carried by invisible hands. The surface of the water held the sky with obedient stillness, except where fish nudged it into rings. He could not look at a horizon without measuring distance, without calculating angles of approach, and the speed of a bullet traveling through air cooling after sunset. His body still believed there was a briefing somewhere he had missed. His hands kept closing into fists around nothing. He could not keep them flat unless he told them, and even then they tried to curl again, like leaves after the first frost. The townspeople began to adjust to his presence, the way you grow used to a thunderstorm that lingers for days. He cut his hair at the same shop he had visited since he was 10. He stood at the back of the hardware store, reading labels on boxes of screws as if each one contained a choice that mattered. At night, he folded and refolded the uniform he no longer wore, smoothing each seam with the stubborn care of a man who feared that if he stopped counting stitches, Something might come apart that held the world together. Sleep arrived like an enemy scout, silent and deceitful. The first hour was a mercy. The second hour began to fray. By the third, he woke with a gasp, certain that the hallway was a corridor of concrete, and the fan above his bed was the thump of helicopter blades. He would lie still and name objects in the room to bring the present back. Lamp, window, photo of mother at the beach, cross made from 2 pieces of walnut his father had glued and sanded. He would reach for the cross and then snatch his hand away because he did not know if his fingers could hold that shape without shaking. The anger began as a small, useful heat that kept him moving through conversations. It grew into a furnace he had not ordered and could not turn off. He found himself snapping at silence. He slammed a cabinet door so hard the glass cracked into an elegant frost pattern. He apologized, gathered the shards with bare fingers, bled, and felt nothing except the relief of visible injury. The people at the diner learned to place his coffee without clink or chatter. He stared at the steam rising from the cup and imagined it twisting into letters that spelled out the names of men who did not come home. The names did not appear. The steam vanished. He blamed the coffee for not being strong enough. One afternoon, he volunteered to help his father fix a fence near the back of the yard where wild roses crawled over the posts and the boards tilted like tired shoulders. The old hammer felt right in his palm, the wood handle smooth with decades of use. He lifted, swung, and drove a nail with a control that surprised him. For a moment he remembered being 8 years old and building a birdhouse on a Saturday. The smell of pine sap, the ordinary miracle of a square box becoming a shelter for something that could fly. Then the head of the hammer slipped, the nail bent, and the board split just enough to undo the illusion of competence. The anger did not flare. It erupted. He brought the hammer down again and again, not on the nail, but on the post, until the post cracked and the roses trembled, and his father shouted his name in a voice that was part command and part plea. Richard stopped, only because his arms burned. He looked at the ruins and felt the sick relief again, as if he had matched the outside of something to the inside at last. He threw the hammer into the grass and walked away without a word. Rumors followed him like dogs with low growls. Someone said he had destroyed a mailbox with his bare hands after the latch stuck. Someone said he had slammed a pool cue against the table so hard that the felt split like a wound. He tried to count his breaths, the way the therapist at the base had taught him, in through the nose, hold, out through the mouth, hold, repeat. It made him feel like he was drowning more slowly. He did push-ups until his shoulders shook. He ran along the river path until his lungs felt like paper cut and folded too many times. The heat did not leave him. It stored itself in his bones like winter firewood. On Sunday, he stood on the sidewalk across from St. Brigid Church, watching families filter through the open doors. The stone steps held a season's worth of dust, and the brass handles on the doors glowed with the touch of many hands. He remembered walking there as a boy in a jacket 2 sizes too big, his mother smoothing his hair with her palm, his father nodding to the usher who always pretended not to see children sneaking a second cookie at the parish hall. The bell rang. The sound was clear, not large, not small, simply true. He looked away, ashamed that the sound troubled him. He knew exactly how many steps led to those doors. He could picture the statue of the Virgin Mary in the small alcove to the right of the sanctuary, blue mantle, white robe, hands open, as if she had just finished welcoming someone and would be glad to welcome someone else. The memory scraped like sand against his throat. He tried to pray once. He sat on the edge of his bed with the cross his father had made. He said words he had not spoken in years. He provided the correct sequence. He could have drawn the prayer like a map. Halfway through, he stopped. It felt like handing a letter to a faceless courier who would never deliver it. He placed the cross on the dresser with care, as if it were a fragile instrument he would need later but could not play yet. The town held a parade for Independence Day. Fireworks were promised. He told himself he would be ready. He tried to translate blasts into abstract light. He pressed his palms against his knees and sat on the porch while bursts rippled above the school field. The first explosion turned his heart into a trapped bird. The second turned the porch into a bunker and the sky into a burning map. He stood without feeling his legs and reached for the doorframe, the way a man falls toward a rail on a ship. His mother appeared beside him, said nothing, and stood as still as a lighthouse while he stared at the road and waited for the barrage to end. When it did, he realized he had gripped the doorframe so hard he had left crescents in the paint. He whispered that he was sorry. She said that he was home. The words did not match, but she said them with enough belief that for a moment he could imagine they might become true. He took a job at the feed store 2 mornings a week. The sacks were heavy and honest. He moved them from truck to pallet, from pallet to pickup bed, from pickup bed to the back of a barn, where a boy in muddy boots thanked him with a look that was more grateful than words. The routine helped until it did not. On a day when a thunderstorm rolled in from the west with a grumble like a tired god, a pallet broke under the weight of sacks, and the sound of wood snapping shot through him like a command. He yelled. He did not understand the word he made. He hurled one sack into another and watched the dust cloud rise as if he could smoke out whatever memory cowered in the corners of his skull. The owner, a patient woman with hands strong from lifting, did not fire him. She told him to go home. He walked out into rain that felt colder than it should have been for July. Not all of him was rage. Some part of him was a field cut down to stubble after harvest, waiting for a farmer who might never arrive. At night, he found old notebooks and flipped through pages of drawings he had made as a teenager, sketches of bridges and trees and faces he had tried to remember. He attempted a new drawing. The pencil moved across the paper with the careful quiet of a scout. He drew a hand, then another, then the space between 2 hands that did not touch. He shaded the space with patience until it felt like fog. When he looked up, an hour had passed, and his breath felt normal. He closed the notebook and slid it under his bed as if it were a small animal he hoped would stay alive until morning. He avoided the church not because he hated it, but because he feared that if he crossed the threshold, his story would have to admit a chapter he did not know how to write. He walked past it at odd hours, as if the building were a sleeping giant and he did not wish to wake it. The statue of the Virgin Mary in the courtyard stood above a circle of azaleas, her gaze lifted, her hands in a gesture that could have been blessing or invitation. He did not look directly at her. He could feel the outline of her face, the way a blindfolded man feels the outline of a door. A rumor reached him that an old friend from his unit had moved 2 states away and started over, found work, found love, found a way to carry the silence like a lake in his chest instead of a crater. Richard told himself that some men were built for carrying and some were built for breaking. He did not admit that he could not tell which one he was anymore. One evening he walked to the school gym to watch a youth basketball game because the sound of sneakers on polished wood and a whistle's short sentence were parts of a language he still understood. A boy missed a shot at the buzzer and slammed the ball, and a father in the stands shouted at the child with a fury too large for the moment. Something hot and bright rose in Richard. He stood and faced the father without a word. The man looked at him, saw a storm that had traveled a long way, and sat down. Richard left the gym shaking, not with triumph, but with fear of the person who had answered on his behalf. He did not want to be the man whose shadow made other men shut their mouths. He walked home along the street where the lights hung low over porches and televisions flickered through thin curtains. He passed the church again. The doors were closed, the lights glowed in the stained glass like embers. He thought of the lake and the way water holds the sky without breaking, and he wondered if there existed a way to hold pain without breaking. He did not step closer. He did not flee. He stood at the gate of the churchyard and placed his hand on the iron bar, cool and real, beneath his palm. He counted his breaths, not to control them, but to prove they still arrived of their own accord. Then he let go and kept walking, because it was not yet the night when he would open those doors, but it was a night closer than the one before. Richard Kane sat in the darkened kitchen with the hum of the refrigerator for company and a half-empty bottle of bourbon sweating on the table. The clock ticked louder than it had any right to, each second hammering into him like the tail end of artillery. He rubbed the scar on his forearm as if it were a worry stone, as if by tracing its jagged path he might find some sense of direction. His mother had long since given up asking him to come to church. His father avoided the subject altogether, retreating to the shed when Richard's temper boiled too close to the surface. Alone in the kitchen, he stared at the wallpaper his mother had chosen years ago, faded green leaves repeating their cheerful pattern. He hated it, hated the persistence of its optimism. He slammed his fist against the table, and the bottle toppled, bourbon spilling across the surface like a small flood. He let it spread rather than clean it, watched it creep toward the edge until it dripped onto the floorboards. The sound was steady, merciless, each drop an accusation. The outbursts grew more frequent. A man bumped him at the gas station, and Richard nearly shoved him through the windshield of his own car. A child's balloon popped outside the grocery store, and Richard dropped to the ground, hands over his head, until laughter turned to frightened silence and mothers pulled their children away. At night, he roamed the streets of his hometown, boots striking pavement in a rhythm that made dogs bark from behind fences. Some neighbors left their porch lights off, hoping darkness would conceal them. Others left lights blazing, as if illumination might hold him at bay. Richard felt their fear, fed on it, despised it, and yet could not resist walking those streets again and again. Rage had become his compass, pointing nowhere, pulling him everywhere. He returned one evening from the feed store with dust on his boots and heard his parents arguing behind closed doors. His name floated through the walls, followed by words like unstable, dangerous, hopeless. He pressed his forehead against the doorframe and listened, his jaw tight, his breath shallow. The voices fell silent when they realized he was there. His mother opened the door, eyes red, lips pressed tight, as if holding back a prayer. His father stared at him, unblinking. Richard walked away without a word, but each step felt like another nail driven into the coffin of the man he had been before the war. The bar became his second home. He sat in the corner, the jukebox spitting out country songs about heartbreak and hard roads, and he drowned himself in liquor until the faces of his fallen brothers stopped visiting him. Some nights he played pool with men who knew enough to let him win. Other nights he snapped a cue in half, the splintering wood echoing like a rifle crack. The bartender learned to slide the glass without touching his hand. Women who once admired his uniform now whispered about his eyes, too wild, too restless, as if they had seen things not meant to be spoken. Richard left the bar each night heavier than when he entered, staggering into alleys where shadows stretched like enemies waiting in ambush. It was on a Sunday evening, when the town bell rang for vespers, that Richard's fury found its target. He had been walking for hours, sweat clinging to his shirt, the bourbon in his veins mixing with the salt of his own exhaustion. The bell's chime pierced him, steady, insistent, as if daring him to remember the God he had abandoned. He clenched his fists, muttered curses, and followed the sound like a hunter trailing prey. The closer he came, the louder the bell tolled, not with joy, not with welcome, but with accusation. He imagined the walls of the church whispering his failures, the stained glass windows watching him with cold, unblinking eyes. The doors of St. Brigid Church stood open, their brass handles catching the last of the evening Sunday. Families exited with quiet reverence, fathers carrying toddlers, mothers clutching prayer books. They stepped aside when they saw him, eyes dropping, conversations strangled into silence. Richard walked past them with the swagger of a man who wanted to be stopped but knew no one would dare. Inside, the air smelled of candle wax and old wood, a mixture both comforting and suffocating. The pews stood in neat rows, soldiers at attention, waiting for orders he would never give. At the far end, in her alcove, the Virgin Mary looked down with hands open, her marble face serene. Richard hated that serenity more than he had hated the enemy. He hated the calm that mocked his storms, the stillness that reminded him of graves. He approached the altar, each step echoing louder than the last, until he stood before her. His breath came in ragged bursts. He thought of the nights his grandmother's voice had led him through the rosary bead by bead. He thought of the day he had marched with his unit, medals gleaming, believing in glory. He thought of the friends whose blood still stained his memory. And he thought of silence, God's silence, Mary's silence, heaven's silence. It was too much. He drew the pistol from his jacket. The weight was familiar, comforting, a terrible friend who never left his side. The cold steel steadied his shaking hand. He lifted it, pointed it at her chest, and shouted words that reverberated against the vaulted ceiling. Where were you when they died? Where were you when I begged for help? Show me you are more than stone. Show me, or I will shatter you into dust. The church stood still. No wind stirred, no candle flickered. His voice cracked into echoes that refused to die. He tightened his grip, finger trembling over the trigger. Sweat slid down his temple, into his eye, burning like salt. He blinked it away, but kept his gaze fixed on the marble figure, daring it to move, daring it to answer. Behind him, a priest emerged from the sacristy, voice trembling yet firm. "Richard, stop. You do not know what you are about to do." Richard did not turn. "I know exactly what I am about to do. I am ending a lie." The priest's footsteps faltered, the echo of leather shoes swallowed by silence. Richard's pulse thundered louder than any sermon. He raised his chin, met the unchanging eyes of the Virgin, and whispered through clenched teeth, "You will never hear me beg again." Then, with all the fury he had carried from desert sands to quiet streets, he pulled the trigger. The gunshot split the silence of the church like lightning tearing open a midnight sky. Richard Kane's ears rang with the violence of it. His chest heaved with the force of the recoil, and for a heartbeat he thought he had finally won his war against faith. The bullet struck the marble statue of the Virgin Mary with surgical precision, and the sacred figure shattered in a burst of stone fragments. Dust filled the air, drifting like smoke, settling over the pews and floor. Pieces of marble clattered onto the tiles, echoing through the sanctuary, as though mocking the silence that followed. Richard lowered the pistol slightly, a grim sneer twisting his face. "Stone," he muttered, "nothing but stone." The congregation of witnesses, those few who lingered after evening prayers, gasped in horror. A mother clutched her child, shielding young eyes from the desecration. An elderly man crossed himself with trembling hands. The priest stood frozen near the altar, lips moving in a prayer that stumbled over itself, words barely audible over the ringing in Richard's ears. For a moment, the church seemed to sink into despair, the smell of gunpowder hanging heavy in the air. But then the impossible happened. From the pile of shattered fragments, a faint shimmer began to glow. At first it seemed like dust catching the last rays of sunlight, a trick of vision, a fleeting glimmer. Yet it grew brighter, steadier, until it pulsed with a radiance too fierce to be dismissed. The marble fragments lifted from the ground as if carried by unseen hands. The dust in the air thickened into a luminous haze, filling the nave with an otherworldly brilliance. Richard staggered back, shielding his eyes. His weapon slipped in his grip, suddenly heavy, useless. "No," he whispered, his voice quivering. "This is not real. Is lever is one's lever is not. In the May, is lever is one dos." The light swelled, expanding until it filled every corner of the sanctuary. The stained glass windows glowed with impossible intensity, the blues and reds igniting like fire. Shadows fled as though chased by a dawn more powerful than the sun itself. Parishioners fell to their knees, their voices rising in cries of awe and terror. Some wept openly. Others prayed aloud, words tumbling over one another. In the midst of the brilliance, the broken statue reassembled itself. Shards of marble knit together, cracks sealing as though time itself reversed. The Virgin Mary stood once more in her alcove, flawless, radiant, her hands open as before. Yet she was no longer only marble. A figure of living light emerged from the statue, towering, gentle, majestic. The Virgin's face shone with sorrow and compassion, her eyes glistening with tears that were not stone but luminous drops of heaven itself. Richard fell to his knees, trembling. His weapon clattered to the floor, the sound pitiful against the divine symphony of light. He tried to speak, but his throat closed tight, as if every word of rage he had ever shouted was now choking him. His chest ached with the weight of his own heartbeat. The Virgin turned her gaze toward him. It was not anger that met him, nor judgment. It was a sorrow deeper than oceans, a love purer than fire. Her voice filled the sanctuary, not through sound, but through every trembling heart. "My child, why do you wound me? I have never left you, not in the trenches of war, not in the nights of your despair. I stood with you when you cursed the heavens. Even now I weep for you, not in wrath, but in mercy." Richard's breath caught. Memories crashed into him, the rosary beads in his grandmother's hands, his mother's soft prayers by his bedside, the first communion he had once received with joy. He saw the faces of fallen comrades, men who had died with prayers on their lips while he had spat curses into the smoke. The weight of his sins pressed upon him with unbearable force. "No," he croaked, pressing his forehead against the cold tile. "I do not deserve this. I have done nothing but destroy." His hands shook violently as he reached toward the light, as if grasping for forgiveness that felt too far away. The Virgin's tears fell, striking the ground, and where they landed, flowers bloomed, delicate lilies sprouting between cracks in the stone floor. A fragrance filled the air, sweet and healing, washing away the stench of gunpowder. Parishioners gasped and cried harder, reaching out to touch the blossoms. Richard felt his body collapse under the weight of it all. The pistol lay discarded, forgotten. The fury that had been his fuel burned out, leaving only ashes and the faint spark of a man who had once believed. Tears, real, human, bitter tears spilled from his eyes. For the first time in years, he let them fall. The Virgin's light enveloped him. She did not step closer, yet her presence pressed against him like a mother embracing a lost child. Her voice lingered in his soul. "Return, my son. Lay down your weapon. The war is over. The battle within you can be healed." 16. Start. Richard lifted his head, his face streaked with tears, and stared at the restored statue glowing with gentle fire. His lips trembled, forming words he had long abandoned. "Forgive me," he whispered, the phrase breaking him open like the gunshot had broken the marble. "Forgive me." The church bells began to toll. Though no hand pulled their ropes, they rang across the town, carrying the sound of miracle into the night. People emerged from their homes, looking toward the glowing church that lit the sky, as if dawn had arrived hours early. Inside, the parishioners sobbed and prayed. And at the center of it all, Richard Kane knelt broken and reborn, trembling before the miracle that had shattered his hatred and lit his soul with a flame no war could extinguish. Richard Kane could not rise from the floor, his knees pressed into the cold tiles, his palms flat against the ground, as though he were clinging to the earth itself to keep from being swept away. The pistol lay inches from his hand, but it might as well have belonged to another lifetime. The glow that filled the sanctuary did not fade. It lingered like dawn, refusing to surrender today, soft and eternal. Around him, the parishioners whispered prayers, their voices breaking with awe. Some wept openly, their tears mingling with the petals of lilies that had sprung where the Virgin's light had touched the floor. The fragrance of those flowers hung in the air, washing over Richard's ragged breath. He felt as though every inhale drew in mercy, every exhale released fragments of his rage. The priest stepped closer, his cassock brushing lightly against the stones. His face was pale, but his eyes shone. "Richard," he whispered, though his voice carried through the entire church. "You have seen what few ever will. Do not waste this moment. Confess. Let the truth leave your chest before it consumes you." Richard lifted his head, his eyes swollen, his cheeks damp. He saw the restored statue of the Virgin Mary glowing faintly in her alcove, her marble face now alive in memory with the sorrowful gaze she had turned on him. The weight inside him, built through years of anger and blood, pressed so heavily that words threatened to choke him. But he opened his mouth, and they came. "I mocked her," he said, his voice cracking, raw. "I mocked her every day of my life since the war. I spat at heaven. I cursed God when my brothers fell, when their blood soaked the dirt beside me. I told myself there was no one listening, that it was only stone, only silence. I let my hate grow until it became the only thing I knew. I struck my own father. I frightened children. I broke everything I touched because I thought if the world looked like me, I would feel less alone." His chest heaved, his words tumbling now in sobs. "But I was wrong. I was so wrong." The priest knelt beside him, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. Richard turned his face into that touch as though it were the first human kindness he had allowed in years. Tears fell from him, heavy and unrelenting, soaking the floor beneath. "I destroyed her image," he continued, voice hoarse. "And she came to me not with wrath but with love. She wept for me. Me, a man who deserves nothing but judgment. How can this be?" The congregation pressed closer. An elderly woman whispered the Hail Mary over and over, her rosary beads clicking like raindrops. A young boy peeked from behind his mother's skirts, wide-eyed, watching the soldier who had terrified the town now sob like a child. The people had feared Richard Kane. Now they pitied him. Now they prayed for him. Richard pressed his forehead to the floor. "Forgive me," he cried. "Forgive me, Mother of God. Forgive me, Lord Jesus. I am broken. I am stained with blood. I am lost." His sobs echoed through the sanctuary until they became almost indistinguishable from the voices of prayer rising all around him. The Virgin's presence still filled the space. Richard felt her words not through his ears but in his heart, gentle and sorrowful. "I have not abandoned you, my child. Even in your rage, I remained. Even in your sin, I wept for you. Return, and you will be healed." Richard raised his head again. He reached for the pistol, but only to push it away. The weapon clattered against the tiles, sliding beneath a pew. He held out his empty hands. "No more," he declared, his voice shaking but resolute. "No more death, no more anger. I lay it all down. Milagem si vin pris, in the fires, in the felon." The priest lifted his hand and made the sign of absolution, his words calm yet commanding. "By the authority of Christ and his church, I absolve you of your sins. Rise, Richard Kane, not as a soldier of war, but as a man of God's mercy." Something within Richard broke wide open. He felt it leave him the bitterness, the poison, the furnace of rage that had consumed him for years. In its place came a lightness so strange it terrified him. He wept again, but now the tears carried peace. He stood, unsteady, as though learning to walk anew. His eyes met the faces of those gathered. "I am sorry," he said to them, voice trembling. "I have frightened you. I have hurt you. Tonight I have seen what no bullet can destroy, and I cannot remain the same. I beg your forgiveness." The people began to weep louder, some rushing forward to embrace him. The priest smiled through his own tears. Bells rang again from the tower, though no rope moved, their peals cascading across the town as if heaven itself declared the soldier's confession. Outside, neighbors looked up at the church, glowing faintly against the night, listening to the bells. Inside, Richard Kane stood among the people he had once terrified, humbled, broken, but reborn. The Virgin's statue now seemed alive, even in stillness, its marble smooth and whole. The memory of her radiant form lingered in every soul present. And in Richard's chest, where once there had been only fire and ashes, there was now something new, fragile but real. The first spark of faith he thought he had lost forever. Richard Kane awoke the next morning to the sound of birdsong instead of artillery in his dreams. For the first time in years, his sleep had not been a battlefield. Sunlight spilled across the wooden floor of his room, gentle and unthreatening. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at his hands. These were the same hands that had once gripped rifles and hurled rage at the world, but they looked different now. They trembled not from anger, but from awe. He closed his fingers slowly, whispering a prayer he had nearly forgotten. "Hail Mary, full of grace." The words tasted foreign on his tongue, yet sweet, like water after a drought. News of the miracle spread faster than he could comprehend. By noon, people he did not recognize came knocking on his parents' door, asking if it was true. Did the soldier really destroy the statue? Did the Virgin appear? Did heaven touch their church? Some wept before even hearing his answer, certain already that God had visited their small American town. Pilgrims began to arrive within days, kneeling before the statue that had been shattered and restored. Some pressed rosaries against it, others left flowers, and many swore that when they touched the base of the pedestal, they felt warmth surge into their hearts. Richard watched them with humility, still unable to fully believe that heaven had chosen to reveal mercy through his brokenness. He met often with Father Brennan, the priest who had witnessed everything. Their conversations stretched late into the night, words circling around scripture, confession, and the weight of calling. Richard confessed again and again, not out of doubt, but out of a desperate need to cleanse every corner of his soul. Father Brennan listened patiently, then said one evening, "Richard, miracles are not given to humiliate us. They are invitations. The Virgin's tears were not for your destruction, but for your healing. And healing always leads to purpose." Those words burrowed deep. Richard began to study, first in secret, then openly, pouring himself into theology books, learning Latin prayers he had once mocked, memorizing scripture with the discipline of a soldier preparing for battle. His neighbors watched, stunned, as the man who had terrified children now sat on the church steps, reading a Bible until dusk. When Sunday came, he no longer lurked in the shadows. He walked down the aisle with steady steps, head bowed, and received communion with tears in his eyes. The parishioners embraced him, some still cautious, but many recognizing the sincerity of a man reborn. Months turned to years. Richard entered seminary. The transition was grueling. Not because of study he embraced discipline with ease, but because his past haunted him. Professors looked at his scars, classmates whispered about the miracle, and he often doubted if he belonged. But in his lowest moments, when he felt temptation to walk away, he remembered the night of light, the Virgin's sorrowful eyes, the lilies blooming from the floor. He pressed those memories against his doubts as one presses a bandage against a wound. Slowly, healing took root. When he was ordained, the church overflowed. Veterans in uniform filled the pews, some broken like he once had been. Mothers carried children who had heard tales of the miracle. The statue of the Virgin stood adorned with roses, her face calm, her hands open. Richard lay prostrate before the altar, his body stretched in surrender, and the congregation prayed over him. When he rose, wearing the vestments of a priest, the bells rang not by human hands, but by the same unseen power that had told them the night of the miracle. People gasped, cried, and rejoiced. Heaven itself seemed to celebrate. Father Richard Kane's ministry grew beyond the small town. He traveled across America, telling his story in parishes, schools, and shelters. He spoke not as a hero, but as a penitent, declaring that no one was beyond redemption. He told veterans racked by nightmares that healing was possible. He told addicts drowning in despair that grace was real. He told skeptics that miracles still walked among them, for he had been one. His words were not polished or poetic. They were raw, torn from the fabric of his own wounds, and because of that, people believed him. The church where it began became a pilgrimage site. Pilgrims lit candles at the statue, whispering prayers, leaving photographs of loved ones, crutches of the healed, letters of gratitude. Some swore they smelled lilies blooming even in winter. Many testified to peace settling over them the moment they stepped into the sanctuary. The Vatican sent investigators, theologians, scientists, They examined, tested, questioned, but the people did not wait for declarations. For them, the truth had already burned itself into their souls. Richard never forgot who he had been. He often stood at the back of the church late at night, staring at the statue, whispering, "Thank you." Sometimes he wept again, not from guilt but from gratitude. The war had nearly destroyed him, but the Virgin's tears had rebuilt him. He carried scars still, both visible and hidden, but he no longer feared them. They were part of his testimony, proof that God's mercy had touched even the darkest corners. In the final years of his life, he would often tell the same words to every crowd, every classroom, every soul who would listen. "I was a man who shot at heaven, and heaven did not strike me down. Heaven wept for me. Heaven loved me back to life. If God's mercy could reach me, then it can reach you." And always, in the silence that followed, people wept not in fear, but in hope. The hope that if a soldier like Richard Kane could fall to his knees and rise again as a servant of faith, then no one was truly beyond redemption. The miracle had not ended that night in the church. It lived on in every heart that believed, every tear that turned into prayer, every sinner who dared to hope that even shattered lives could be made whole again.